All right, so I'm I'm going over two libraries I wrote almost a year and a half ago. I presented these at the first quasi-EmberConf, EmberCamp, but I actually wrote them the night before, so my presentation was not very good. But now I've had plenty of time to flesh them out, even though they're not 1.0'd yet. So Ember-Validations and Ember-EasyForm. Leah did a good job of introducing me. Brian, Cardarella, CEO, Dockyard, blah, blah, blah. So Ember-Validations and Ember-EasyForm are best of friends. They are complementary libraries, but they're also independent. They can be run independently. A better way to think about them is that Ember-Validations' only concern is about the model layer, whereas Ember-EasyForm's only concern is about the view layer. So before we move forward, I want to actually go over and establish two rules that I've looked at when building out these libraries. And the first one seems pretty obvious, although I'm very shocked by how many people violate this. Server-side validations ensure your data integrity, not client-side validations. If you are validating on the client, but you're not validating your data on the server, stop what you're doing and go fix it. Somebody will poke around and they will find a way to inject data into your server, into your back end, and you're like, how'd they get around my awesome client-side validations? Because you're building an Ember application. You now are exposing an API to everybody. The other rule is that, given the first rule, client-side validations' only role is to actually guide a user into how to submit data. It should not be used for anything else. And that goes for form submissions, whether you're using validations to actually, if you're building out some more like GUI components that actually are responding to valid states, then the view layer should present a guide for your users to actually push them to submitting data properly. So Ember-Validations itself, it's hosted here on the Dockyard GitHub repo. We build all of our Travis CI greens onto builds.dockyard.com. That was put together by one of our devs, Robert Jackson. Coincidentally, he did the same thing for Ember, so the builds.ember.js.com was done by Robert as well. However, there is something's wrong with Travis. I saw it the other day. So the Ember-Validations is, Travis is great, except for when it stops working. You have no idea why, because you can't actually access that. So it's passing locally for us, but if you want to use Ember-Validations right now with the latest release of Ember, please grab a gist that I compiled locally. If you just go to gist.github.com/bcardarella, it's like one of the first ones on there if you don't feel like memorizing that number. So are those okay for everyone to see, by the way? Because that's essentially what they're looking like. Yes? Okay. So here's a very simple Ember-Validations example. We first start by mixing in the Ember-Validations traits into our object that we're going to validate against. Here I'm using an object controller, but later on I'll use a regular Ember object. And then here is the validations rules. So that's essentially all you're going to be mixing in, or actually the only changes that you're making directly to your objects that you want to validate against. The validation rule set itself is comprised of properties. So these should be properties that are directly accessible on the object that you're validating. And then each of those properties has rules. So the rules are going to map back to the classes for the given validator. And then, the values for each of those rules will be options passed in. In this case, presence doesn't, I'm not taking, or rather I'm not submitting any options to it, so I just have the placeholder of true, which is just for conciseness. Here's a little bit more complex validation example. So in this case, I actually can override the message for the presence validator. And there is a light internationalization-esque library built into Ember-Validations. In fact, if you're using James Rosen's I18N library, Ember-Validations will probably prefer that instead. So you can internationalize your messages. So here's an example of passing different options there. For the length validator, we have a minimum option. The README has a full list of all the options for all the validators. So I can pass in maximum as well, or range. Age, just numericality, and that has its own options. So if you're looking at these and you're saying that these look a little familiar, then you might be a Rails developer, or you might have a background in Rails, and that is because I have a background in Rails. I was still doing Rails, since 2006. So my brain's been saturated with active model validations, active record validations. However, the thing here is that in, sorry, I want to see these first. So the validations that I've included into Ember-Validations are what I call the common validations: absence, acceptance, confirmation, exclusion, format inclusion, length, numericality, and presence. So the validations were, they say that really fast? Okay. The validations that are included in here are fine, but if you're familiar with the way that Rails does it, this isn't really ideal for Ember applications. Rails will validate your data when you opt into it. So if you save your record, it'll run through the validations. If you are checking to see if the record's valid, it'll run your validations. So these are validations that you're just opting into. They're not happening automatically. That's because in a request response cycle, the end user doesn't care if they happen when you're actually setting the properties to given data or right before the response comes back. Because all the user cares about in the request response cycle is that at the end, I have a full payload of the proper information. However, in Emberland, we're concerned about the client. We're concerned about actually showing a more interactive experience. If you have a little widget on your page and you click it to off and the user's not supposed to click it to off, we don't want developers to have to go in and kick off the validations manually to actually show that invalid state. So given that Ember likes to auto-update all around it, Ember-Validations itself is employing on the model layer, I want to be very specific, on the model layer, live validations, meaning that when data changes for a given property, it will kick off the corresponding validations. So to better understand how Ember-Validations work, or rather the individual validator classes work under the hood, and what I'm going to be getting to in a little bit, concept of the validation graph, I'm going to break down the base validator class that all validators will derive off of or extend off of. So in the init function, the first thing that you notice is that the validator instances themselves. So these are classes, and when you actually build the validators, it will create an instance of the validator. So it's not going through and just grabbing this validator every single time. We're actually working off an instance. And each of these instances have their own errors array. This is because certain validations could perhaps actually generate more than one error message. The property that you're passing in or that you're defining the validation off of in the validation hash is being pushed into the dependent validation keys array. So the reason why this is done, rather than having a specific property, is because there could be validators that are concerned by more than one property. For example, the confirmation validator. Imagine you have a password confirmation and you change your password confirmation, you change your password field and you go change your password confirmation field. If you change the first field, and when you get the second field to being equal to the first field is, it should be observing both fields. So if you go back up and you change the original password field, the confirmation validator should fire again and should now show invalid. So you want to be observing all of the proper properties for each validator as possible. So if you want to write your own custom validators that are very complex, you want to observe more than one given property, you're going to push those onto the dependent validation keys array. And then when any of those properties change or notify a property change on those properties, the validator will run the call function. So in the base validator, this is empty by default. Each of the other validators, we'll see in a second, the presence validator, will extend this out. This is the function that actually gets run every single time your validator fires. Finally, each validator has an isValid flag. The isValid flag is actually checking to see if there are any messages in the errors array. So if you're not familiar with computed properties in Ember, you definitely should read up on them. They're awesome. But the computed.empty computed property, we pass it this array path. It will actually go through and make sure that the array is empty. And if it is valid is true. If it's not, is valid is false. And ipso facto, so we know that our validator is, our validation failed if there are any errors in the message. Sorry, if there are any messages in the errors array. The presence validator here, I'm just going to go through one of them, but this is a simple example. Extends off the base validator. You'll notice that there's a local namespace. I started out by namespacing between local and remote, even though there is no support for remote validators yet. The init function will first call up the superchain, so we want to grab everything that the parent class has. Then down here, it will actually set up the message type, grabbing the message, or render the message rather, from the Ember-Validations message property. So if you've dug into Rails validations, the blank, you can see it, but this guy right here, that's, I use the naming conventions off of the validation messages from Rails. So if you wanted to change that message somewhere up the chain in Ember-Validations IE10 library or support, or in James Rosen's, you would change it on blank. Finally, the call function is, again, what gets run. And if the validation fails, it pushes the message onto the errors object. So if you have a far more complex validator, if I were to show you the length validator, you'd see multiple places where there are potential for messages to be pushed onto the errors object, because there could be multiple configurations for that validator to fail. So this starts to tie into what a concept that I've been talking about for a little bit called the validation graph. And the validation graph is an idea where you have, you can build up very complex validation scenarios amongst different objects that are related to one another very, very quickly in Ember-Validations. So to get a better understanding of how that works, when you actually mix in the Ember-Validations mixin into an object, and that object instantiates, it creates its own validators array that all validator instances get pushed onto. Oh, that's what number 2 is. So it created the array, pushes the instances of validators onto that, and then the object that, not the instances of the validators, but the object that you're actually validating, has its own isValid flag. And that will observe the aggregate property of validators.addEach is valid. That's not a valid path, but gives you the basic concept that it will actually filter and find if there are any isValid flags on any of the validator instances that are false, then the object that you're validating is false. If they're all true, then the object that you're validating is true. Here's a very watered down example of this. I didn't actually assign variable names to these, but imagine that the top Ember object is an owner object and the bottom one is a dog object, and there is a relationship between the owner and the dog. The owner has one dog. So down here, the dog object has its own validation rules. And so if the name is not provided, that dog's isValid state is going to be false. Up here in the owner's validation rules, I provide a property that references the path to that relationship. Instead of passing in a hash, I pass in just true. Ember-Validations, if it sees true instead of an object, it will make an assumption that we're dealing with a relationship now. And what happens internally is that it will grab that relationship object, in which case it's the instance of dog, and it will push that onto the validators array. The reason this becomes important is because the validators array only cares if each member of that array has an isValid flag. It doesn't care if that given member is an instance of a validator or not. So you can have another Ember object pushed into that array that has its own validation rules. And then that Ember object could have other objects that are also in there. So you can start to imagine that you can build out a very deep, what I call the validation graph, very, very easily. So here, simple animation describing this. If you imagine that each of these blue circles are a given object, and each of these blue circles have their own validation rules. So this may represent this tree here, the relationships amongst different objects. And if one all the way at the bottom, if like this has a length validator that is not satisfied, that validation state will bubble all the way back up to the top. So this allows you to build out very, very complex, what I call validation graphs, very easily. And it's actually worked out to be pretty cool. So Ember validations, that's the gist of it. There's a good more detail in the README on the GitHub project, but some known issues that exist in the project, as I'm sure people have questions about because these are the ones I get all the time. No uniqueness yet. One of my devs has a PR pending right now on implementing uniqueness. I was holding off for a long period of time only because I was hoping that the JSON API spec would have some opinion on this, but it doesn't seem that to be the case, so I don't want to wait any longer. The other side of it was I did not want the library to have any opinions on how the remote API should implement uniqueness. One of my guys came up with a pretty good solution for this, so this will probably get pulled in pending me getting around to it. Handling server-side errors. So client-side errors, fine, in Ember validations, but what happens if you're using Ember data and you submit your data and then the server responds with a 500 or responds back with its own set of validation errors? There is no good answer to this that I've come up with yet, at least. But I think that if we look back at one of my guiding principles at the beginning was that the client-side validations should only be used to guide your users to using your application. It will help resolve this. So imagine if the server does throw a 500. We want to be able to show that in some way. We should be able to render that properly. What if you have a property on the server that doesn't map directly back to a property on the client? Perhaps you may be able to resolve that in a serializer and actually map it back yourself. But what if it just doesn't exist? What if it's a very specific server-side property that has no concept on the client? How do we actually properly display, or how do we actually even allow the user to resolve these errors on the client? One thing that we've been kicking around is actually having a base property that gets mixed in from the Ember validations, and then this is just used for presentation purposes of here is the errors object that was returned back from the server. We're not going to actually consider this as being part of the validation graph. We're not going to prevent it from being an is valid or not valid state. But if the user needs to be guided in some way, that would be your opportunity for doing so. But again, not done yet. I keep going back and forth on where the proper place to mix in your validations are. Most of the time, I think controller is the proper place. The controller is the context in which you're interacting with your data. If you mix validations into your model, that essentially locks you into a global validation rules for that given model. But when you start working with relationships, you can't go from the model layer up to the controller layer inside Ember. So it becomes a little tricky actually handling the direction of that data between Ember data models, for example. And needs some updating. I wrote this a while back, and it's been kind of building on the tech debt. And it's using the old Ember build system, so a bunch of Ruby stuff in there. We're going to yank that out pretty soon and move it over to Broccoli, all ES6 modules. And once that's done, then we'll probably start doing some rapid updating of it. I'm hoping that we can roll out, if I can resolve number 1 and probably get something in there reasonable for number 2, we can get a 1.0 out eventually, not eventually, soon. Okay, so Ember-EasyForm, the complement of Ember validations. again, Rails influence. If you're a Rails dev, you're probably familiar with a gem called SimpleForm. It allows you to build out more complex form markup very succinctly. And EasyForm is influenced by that. The user experience and form conversion opinions of EasyForm comes from a research article that Luke Wroblewski did for a list apart back in 2009. So how EasyForm actually works with the user experience for Ember validations is that it takes what W did in that article, and he took apart like the multiple ways in which users can enter in data and which one actually yielded the best conversion rates. And it seemed from the article and the data that he had, the best conversion rate was if you are not presented with the error until you tab out of the form element, and then when you tab back in, as soon as you correct it, it goes away. And then as long as you're still in there, if you make another mistake, it comes back until you tab out and resets. I'm going to show that to you. I know maybe my description doesn't sound fantastic, but I'll show you a demo of that in a little bit. So here's the syntax for a very basic form with EasyForm. It takes a form for block helper. You pass in the context you're going to be working with. In this case, I'm just using this, but you can pass in model or any other object. Again, EasyForm does, while it works with Ember validations, it's not married to it. I mean, I know there's the hugging of the tiger earlier on, but all it cares about is an isValid flag and an errors object. So if there is another validation library out there that is exposing that type of API, it actually should work as well. EasyForm will detect those properties and will set things up. So anyway, that will spit out this markup. So you get some, I guess, one person's opinion on what would be a semantic markup for a form. And one thing you'll notice right away is, why is there a form element for a single page application? What purpose could this possibly hold? It's because we have a submit button, and the form element is actually a view, and we're capturing the submit action, submit event rather, and then we send the action up to the actions hash, and either for you to handle on the controller or the route. It's submitted as it's sent as a submit function. So all you have to do is define your own submit function. Submit action. The input is in here, and I'll probably just mess this up at some point in the next few minutes. But so type text for input is the default. The conventions that I put in for EasyForm, again, were brought over from SimpleForm and Rails, and strings are of type text. And I'll show you in a minute that if you set your input as type text, it'll be a text area. I know that sounds a little confusing. Still pre 1.0, so I'm open to debate whether or not that should be there. If you've done your own labels inside Ember, I'm sure you've run into frustrations with how do I actually get it to link up to my input element, because those IDs are programmatically generated for you. They're the Ember GUIDs. Some solutions that you may have come across is actually because label can be a block. You're maybe just wrapping your input inside the label, but what if your design calls for something different? Your label, it doesn't make sense to wrap your input in a label. EasyForm handles this for you automatically. It will grab the GUID for the input, rather for the property. It'll set it up as the for attribute on the label, which of course matches the ID on the input. So that's all set. And finally, there is a span of class error that is in there as well, and that's where all the error messages will be rendered out to. You can add a hint if you'd like. So on the input, you just do hint equals and pass it a string, and it will give you this span of class hint inside the input div. And here's the type text, as text. So you can change the type of the input. It defaults to string, which gives you an input of type text. But if you give it a text string as the type up here, it will give you a text area. Again, confusing. I agree. Here's all the different types that EasyForm will take. So string default, checkbox, select, password, email, URL, URL, however you want to pronounce it, tell, color, search, number, date. I realized today that there's no range in there, so low-hanging fruit if anybody wants to submit a pull request. Another nice thing is that it will actually look at the property name, and it will try to give you, it'll try to intelligently give you the correct input type. So if you have a password property or something that has password in it, for example, password confirmation, it just does a regex on the property name, sees, oh, it's password, and then it will give you an input of type password. Does this for other ones as well, email, URL, color, tell. I don't remember why I set the regex up to, it has to start with tell, but probably because tell is pretty short and can be anywhere else in the string. But I did it like that, and then search. And finally, property value. If your property has a given value, it will try to be smart about setting the input type properly. So in this case, we have a date, and we can see that EasyForm actually set the type for the input as a date type. And the options here are the ones that it will try to match against are numbers, dates, and Booleans. And Booleans will render a checkbox. There are no radio buttons in EasyForm. That's not my fault. It's because there are no radio buttons in Ember. So don't blame me. I know there's a bunch of different solutions out there, but none of them seem to have made it into the core library yet. You may not like the order of the elements that the input helper renders out. So you can actually change the input over from an inline helper to a block helper. You pass it the property name, and then you're going to actually give it, probably can't see it because it's red, it's kind of not a great color, but there's actually, it says input dash field and label dash field in there. Whereas the previous examples had the label render above the input, now we've reversed that, and so it respects the order in which you are defining it here. So we have input first, and then we have label second. And the four helpers that are used internally are input dash field, label dash field, error dash field, and hint dash field. There is no field 4 equivalent just yet on, actually not a very good one on EasyForm. Field 4 inside simple form was a way for you to actually build out semantic markup for relationship objects as well. But now that the with helper inside Ember has been fixed, it's going to be easier. So the reason why I was holding off on it is you can pass in a single object as a relationship, or you can pass in an array of objects as a relationship. An array of objects is easy to render out. We just pass in each, and then we can define the item controller for the each. However, with did not previously have an item controller declaration on it. I added it about 4 or 5 months ago. Then when someone found a really bad error, and so I held off on implementing it inside EasyForm in order to wait for that error to get fixed. And I think it's going to be fixed for the next release of Ember. It was, the patch landed like yesterday or 2 days ago. It needs some updating, as do all my libraries. No valid state. So this is something I really want to add in. Imagine on each of your input elements, the containing div, that if you're typing something that's invalid and it shows the validation error message, you may want to show like a little red X or something. And as soon as you fixed it, you may want to show like green check mark, yay. I just haven't added that in. I think to be really cool. So that's it for my presentation. We're hiring in Boston if anyone wants to move to the sunny shores of Boston. Dockyard. We're full stack consultancy, so we do design, we do project management, we do build out as well. Enterprise startups, we handle it all. And as Leah mentioned, we're also organizing Wicked Good Ember in Boston. That's our crazy Tomster logo that Tom said was going to cause him nightmares. So that's it. Thank you guys very much.